My name is Renee Castillo. I am 35 years old. For 3 years, my mother told my children that their father left because of me, and I let her, because I thought it would hurt them less than the truth. Last Tuesday, at my son's school play, he walked past me without a word, sat 2 rows behind my mother, and waited until the lights dimmed before he stood up and handed her an envelope. Welcome back to my channel, where everyday people carry quiet weight until the moment they finally set it down. If you've ever protected someone at your own expense, I married Marco when I was 26. We met at a community college in Tucson, where he was finishing an associate's degree in HVAC repair, and I was studying early childhood education. He was steady in a way that felt rare to me, quiet but not closed off. He listened more than he talked, and when he did talk, it mattered. We had 2 kids close together. Eli came first, then Sophia 18 months later. Marco worked long hours those first years, building up his own small business, doing residential heating and cooling repairs. I worked part-time at a preschool and took care of the kids the rest of the time. It was not an easy stretch, but it was ours. My mother, Carmen, never liked Marco. She never said it outright, not in those early years. It came out in smaller ways. She'd ask if he was working again on a Sunday, like it was suspicious instead of necessary. She'd comment on his truck, his clothes, the neighborhood we lived in. My mother had married well, by her own measure. My father had been an accountant, and they'd lived comfortably. She had a picture of what her daughter's life should look like, and Marco did not fit inside that picture. When Eli was 5 and Sophia was 3, Marco and I started having real problems. Not affairs, not anything dramatic, just 2 people working too much, sleeping too little, and slowly losing the thread of why they'd started in the first place. We tried counseling for about 4 months. It helped some things and exposed others. By the end of that year, we both knew the marriage was over, even before either of us said it out loud. The divorce itself was not ugly. We agreed on custody without going to court. Marco kept the kids every other weekend and one evening during the week. He paid child support on time, every time, for 3 years straight. I want to be clear about that because it matters for what comes later. He never missed a payment. He never missed a scheduled pickup, not once, for the first year and a half. Then it started to fall apart, but not in the way you'd think. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Marco's mother had a stroke. She lived in Yuma, 2.5 hours away, and she needed full-time care. Marco was the only one of her 3 kids who could realistically take it on. His sister lived in Phoenix with 3 kids of her own, and his brother was overseas with the Air Force. So Marco moved to Yuma to take care of his mother. He told me this in person, sitting at my kitchen table, the same table we'd eaten dinner at for years. He said he didn't want to take the kids further away from their routine, their school, their friends. He said he'd keep paying support, keep calling every week, and come back every other weekend like before, even with the drive. I believed him because I knew him, and for the most part, he kept that promise. The calls happened, the money came. But the every other weekend visits became harder. His mother's care was intense in those first months, and some weekends he genuinely could not leave her. He'd call instead. He'd talk to the kids for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then his mother would need him and he'd have to go. This is where my mother entered the story in a way I didn't fully understand until much later. Carmen started watching the kids more during this stretch, since my work schedule had picked up and Marco's visits had become less predictable. She was there a lot. After school pickups, some weeknight dinners, the occasional overnight when I had a late shift. I started noticing small things maybe a year into this arrangement. Eli, who was 7 by then, stopped asking about his dad as much. Sophia, who was 5, started saying things that didn't sound like things a 5-year-old would come up with on her own. One evening, Sophia was upset because a friend's dad had come to pick her up from a playdate, and she asked me why her dad didn't do things like that anymore. I told her he was taking care of Grandma Lupe, and it was hard for him to visit as much right now, but he loved her very much and called every week. Sophia looked at me and said, "Grandma Carmen said Daddy doesn't come because you made him too sad to stay." I remember exactly where I was standing, at the kitchen counter, putting away dishes. I stopped with a plate in my hand and asked Sophia to say that again. She repeated it, almost exactly the same words, like she'd heard it more than once. I didn't react in front of her. I told her that wasn't true, that sometimes grown-ups have to live in different places for reasons that aren't anyone's fault, and that her dad loved her and Eli very much. She seemed to accept that, the way kids do when they're 5, and went back to her show. But I sat with it that night, and I started paying closer attention. Over the following months, I picked up more pieces. Eli, who was older and more guarded, eventually told me that Grandma Carmen had told him once that sometimes when parents argue too much, the dad just can't take it anymore and has to leave to protect his own peace. He said it casually, like he was repeating a fact he'd absorbed, rather than something that had wounded him. That was almost worse. I confronted my mother about it directly. On the phone, calmly at first, I asked her if she had been telling my kids things about why their father wasn't around more. She got defensive immediately, said she would never say anything bad about Marco, that she only ever told the kids the truth in a way they could understand. I asked her what truth that was. She said, and I remember this almost word for word, I told them that sometimes when a marriage doesn't work, it's because one person pushes too hard and the other person just can't take it anymore. I didn't say his name, I didn't say your name, I just explained how things work. I asked her if she understood what she had actually told 2 small children, that their father left because of their mother, that I had pushed him away, that I was the reason he wasn't there. She said I was being dramatic, that kids forget things, that she would never deliberately hurt her grandchildren, and that maybe if I had handled the divorce differently, none of this would be a conversation we were having. I hung up. I didn't talk to her for almost 2 weeks after that, the longest stretch of silence between us in years. But I also didn't correct the story with my kids in any dramatic way. I told them gently, more than once, that their dad loved them, that nothing about the divorce was anyone's fault the way Grandma had described it, and that grown-ups sometimes grow apart without anyone doing anything wrong. I hoped that would be enough to slowly undo what had been planted. What I didn't do was tell Marco any of this. I told myself it was because he had enough going on with his mother's care, and I didn't want to add a fight from 2.5 hours away to his plate. The truth is, I think I also didn't want to admit how long this had been going on without me noticing, or how much of it I had let slide, because confronting my own mother felt like more than I had energy for. That brings me to last Tuesday. Eli's school was putting on a play, a 4th grade production, loosely based on a unit they'd done on Arizona history. Eli had a small speaking role as a surveyor. He'd been practicing his 5 lines at home for 2 weeks, and he was nervous and excited in the way kids are about these things. My mother came to the play, like she always did for the kids' school events. We sat together near the front, with Sophia between us. The auditorium filled up the way they do, parents finding seats, younger siblings restless in folding chairs. About 10 minutes before the lights went down, I felt someone pass behind our row. I glanced up, and it was Marco. I hadn't seen him in person in almost 8 months. He looked tired but okay, dressed in a button-down shirt, clearly having come straight from somewhere. He didn't stop at our row. He gave me a small nod, nothing more, and kept walking. He sat 2 rows back, on the aisle, by himself. I assumed he'd driven up for Eli's play, which made sense, and that he'd come find us afterward. The lights dimmed, the play started. About halfway through, during a pause between scenes while the kids repositioned themselves on stage, I heard a chair creak behind us. I turned slightly and saw Marco standing up. He walked down the row, past several parents who shifted to let him through, and stopped at the end of our row, right next to where my mother was sitting. He held out a plain white envelope. My mother looked at it, then at him, confused. "What is this?" Marco's voice was quiet but completely steady. He said, "This is from your husband's old work files. I came across it when I was helping move some of his things from storage in Yuma." My mother's expression shifted slightly. My father had passed away 4 years earlier. She took the envelope automatically, the way you do when someone hands you something and you don't know what else to do. Marco said, "I think you should read it. Maybe later, not now, but you should read it." Then he looked at me, just briefly, and said, "I wanted you to know it exists before she says anything else to the kids." He turned and walked back to his seat. The whole exchange took maybe 20 seconds. The lights were still down enough that most people around us hadn't really registered what happened. My mother sat there holding the envelope for the rest of the play. I could feel her tension next to me, but I focused on Eli, who delivered his 5 lines clearly and looked out into the audience afterward, scanning for us, beaming when he found our faces. After the play ended, in the chaos of parents finding their kids and everyone filing toward the exits, my mother pulled me aside. Her hands were shaking slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter, several pages, in my father's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. It was a letter my father had written to Marco's mother, Lupe, years ago. I learned that night that my father and Lupe had known each other long before Marco and I ever met, back when they were young, before either of them married anyone else. The letter wasn't a confession of an affair exactly. It was something quieter and sadder than that. It was a letter my father had written and never sent, apologizing to Lupe for choices he'd made, for a path not taken, for a life that might have looked different. Marco had found it among Lupe's things while sorting through old boxes during her recovery, and recognized my father's name and handwriting from photos he'd seen at our house over the years. My mother read through it, standing in that school hallway, her face going through several expressions I'd never seen on her before. When she finished, she folded it carefully and just stood there for a long moment. I didn't fully understand at first why Marco had chosen that moment, that letter, to hand to her. But as my mother stood there, something in her posture changed. The letter wasn't really about me or Marco or our marriage. It was about my mother's own marriage, about a part of my father's life she apparently never knew existed. And I think, in that moment, she understood something about how stories get told, how versions of the truth get handed down, and how the people telling them aren't always who they claim to be. She looked up at me and said, very quietly, "I need to talk to you, not here." We didn't talk that night. The kids were tired, and it wasn't the moment. But 2 days later, my mother came to my house in the afternoon while the kids were at school. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table, and she told me she was sorry. Not in a sweeping, dramatic way. She said she had told herself a story about Marco for years because it was easier than admitting her own marriage hadn't been what she'd always presented it as, and somewhere along the way, that story had become a weapon she used without fully realizing what it cost. She asked if she could talk to Eli and Sophia to correct what she'd told them. I said yes, but that I wanted to be there and that it needed to be simple and age-appropriate, not another performance. A week later, she sat with both kids and told them plainly that their dad never left because of anything their mom did, that sometimes grown-ups' lives change for reasons that have nothing to do with love, and that their dad loved them very much and always had. Eli, who is older and more skeptical, asked her directly why she'd said something different before. My mother said she'd been wrong and that she was sorry. It wasn't a perfect moment. Eli still seemed unsure, the way kids do when an adult admits to being wrong about something that big. But it was honest, and that mattered more than it being smooth. Marco and I talked on the phone a few days after that. He told me about the letter, about finding it, about deciding to bring it. He said he hadn't planned the moment at the school play specifically. He'd just driven up that day for Eli and happened to have it with him. And seeing my mother sitting there, he made a decision in the moment. He said he didn't do it to embarrass her. He did it because he was tired of being the explanation for something he didn't do, and he thought my mother, of all people, might understand what it felt like to be misrepresented by someone else's story, once she read that letter. He was right. Things are different now. Not perfect, but different. My mother sees the kids less often unsupervised, not as a punishment, but because I needed time to rebuild some trust in how she talks to them when I'm not there. Marco visits more regularly now that his mother has stabilized, and he and I communicate more directly instead of letting things filter through other people. The letter itself sits in a drawer somewhere in my mother's house now. I don't know what she did with it beyond that first reading. I never asked, and she never offered. Some things don't need to be discussed twice. What I learned through all of this is that silence, even when it comes from a good place, can let someone else write the story for the people you love most. I thought I was protecting my kids by not correcting my mother loudly or publicly. What I was actually doing was letting her version become the only version they heard. That is my story. 3 years of a story I didn't tell, a letter that was never meant to find me, and a moment in a dim school auditorium that finally set the record straight. If this reminded you of a time someone else's silence shaped your story, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.
Sign.